I told my Amish husband I was pregnant. He asked, "Who else knew?" The pine floorboards in our kitchen always held the cold, long after the wood stove was lit. But that morning, the chill seemed to rise straight into my bones. I was 24 years old, and for 3 years, my life in the Middlefield District had been measured by silence. It was a silence I had tried to fill with the steady rhythm of baking bread, scrubbing pine tables, and sweeping the gray dust from the hearth. But on that October morning, as the autumn fog clung to the corn husks in the south field, the silence in our home changed. It became heavy, like the air before a summer storm. I stood by the window, my hands pressed flat against my apron, watching my husband, Isaac, as he sat at the long oak table. He was a quiet man, built of hard angles and weathered skin, his shoulders curved from years of behind the plow. When I finally cleared my throat and spoke the words I had carried in secret for 3 days, I expected him to drop his fork. I expected him to look up with the quiet joy of a husband who had waited years for an heir. Instead, his entire body went rigid. He did not look at me. He stared down at his plate, his fork suspended an inch above his eggs, and his voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. He did not ask when the baby was due, or if I was feeling well. He only asked one thing: who else knew? To understand why those words made the breath catch in my throat, I have to go back to the beginning of our marriage, to the day I moved my cedar chest into the farmhouse at the edge of the creek. Isaac was not a man of many words, but in our community, a quiet husband was often seen as a blessing. My mother had told me that a man who kept his thoughts to himself was a man who did not bring trouble home from the fields. My father had passed away the winter before, leaving me with our family's prime 60-acre parcel, the most fertile bottomland in the entire district. It was land that my grandfather had cleared with his own hands, bordered by ancient stone walls and a creek that never ran dry even in the hottest August. Because I was an only child, the deed to that land was my dowry, a heavy responsibility for a young woman of 21. When Isaac asked my uncle for my hand, it seemed like a natural, blessed match. Isaac's family farm bordered ours, and his mother, Martha, was a woman whose influence in the church was as solid as the limestone foundation of the meeting house. In the first year of our marriage, I believed I had found a safe harbor. Isaac was gentle with the horses and diligent with his chores. He never raised his voice, and when he looked at me, there was a kindness in his gray eyes that made the hard work of the farm feel lighter. But our house was never entirely ours. Every Tuesday and Thursday, the blue carriage of my mother-in-law, Martha, would roll up our gravel driveway. Martha was a tall, imposing woman who wore her black bonnet pinned with an exact, severe precision. She did not knock, she simply entered, her boots clicking sharply against the floorboards I had scrubbed the day before. She would walk straight to my pantry, running her fingers along the shelves to check for dust, or examining the jars of preserved peaches I had put up in the cellar. A household that is not fruitful in its work will not be fruitful in its life, Rebecca, she would say, her voice smooth and cold as river ice. I would always nod and offer her tea, swallowing my pride. I trusted her because she was Isaac's mother, and because she was a deacon's widow who knew the ordnung of our district better than anyone. I told myself her constant supervision was merely her way of showing care, of guiding a young wife who had lost her own mother too early. But as the months turned into a year, and then 2 years, without any sign of a child, Martha's visits took on a sharper edge. She no longer spoke of the preserves or the garden. Instead, her eyes would linger on my waistline, and she began to bring small brown paper bags of dried herbs to our kitchen. A wife's primary duty is to build the home and provide the husband with inheritance, Martha told me one afternoon, placing a bag of gray, brittle leaves on the table between us. This is wild carrot seed and blue cohosh. I have brewed it for many women in our family. It purifies the blood and prepares the soil, so to speak. You must drink a cup of it every evening before bed, Rebecca. Isaac needs to see that you are doing everything you can. I did not want to drink the bitter tea. It smelled of damp earth and rot, and it made my stomach churn after only a few sips. But I trusted Martha, and more than that, I trusted the structure of our life. In our district, the older women held the wisdom of the body, and to refuse her medicine would have been seen as a rebellion against the natural order of things. So, every night, under Martha's watchful eye, or Isaac's quiet gaze, I would boil the water and drink the dark, bitter brew. Isaac never spoke of the tea, but he would watch me from his rocking chair by the stove, his face shadowed by the oil lamp. Sometimes I thought I saw a flicker of sadness in his eyes, a desire to reach out and take the cup from my hands, but he always looked away before I could be sure. I rationalized his silence. I told myself he was simply grieving our empty cradle in his own quiet way, that his masculine pride made it difficult for him to discuss such matters. I complied with his mother's demands because I believed that compliance was the only road to peace. By the second year, the pressure did not just come from within our walls. It began to seep in from the wider community. Our district's leader, Bishop Aaron, was a distant cousin of Martha's late husband, and his authority was absolute. He was a man with a gray beard that reached his chest, and eyes that seemed to look right through a person's skin to find their hidden sins. He began to make regular stops at our farm, ostensibly to discuss the yield of the south field or the maintenance of the communal drainage ditches. But inevitably, the conversation would turn. I remember one afternoon in late July, when the heat was so thick the locusts were screaming in the maple trees. I was serving cold mint water to Bishop Aaron and Isaac on the porch. The bishop took a long draught from his jar, wiped his beard with the back of his hand, and looked out over our green pastures. "The Lord has blessed this land with deep soil, Isaac," the bishop said, his voice deep and resonant. "But land without a lineage to tend it is like a lamp without oil. The church trust must always consider the future of our stewardship. Our community cannot afford to have 60 acres of prime bottomland fall into neglect or, heaven forbid, be divided and sold to the English if there are no heirs to claim it under our covenant." My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood in the doorway, holding the pitcher of water. I knew what he was referring to. Under our district-specific property guidelines, which my father had agreed to when he took over the deed, if a landowner died without direct heirs, or if the surviving family was unable to maintain a working household with children to carry on the agricultural covenant within 5 years of marriage, the stewardship of the land could be transferred to the church's community trust. The trust would then lease the land to another family, and the childless widow or couple would be moved to a smaller, communal cottage near the village, stripped of their independent holding. It was a rule designed to keep the colony's agricultural output high, but in practice, it felt like a ticking clock. "We are praying on it, Bishop," Isaac said quietly, his head bowed. "Prayer is the seed, but obedience is the water," Bishop Aaron replied, his gaze shifting to me as I stood in the shadow of the screen door. "And sometimes, the soil must be examined to see why it does not yield." That night, after the bishop left, I went to Isaac in the barn. He was brushing down our oldest mare, his movements slow and mechanical. The lantern light cast long, dancing shadows against the hand-hewn beams of the barn. "Isaac," I said, my voice trembling, "do you think we should go to the town? To the clinic near the highway? My cousin Sarah told me about a doctor there who helps couples who are struggling to have children. Perhaps there is a simple thing we do not know." Isaac stopped brushing the mare. He kept his back to me for a long time, his hand resting on the horse's flank. When he finally turned, his face was pale, his eyes wide with a fear I had never seen in him before. "No, Rebecca," he said, his voice uncharacteristically sharp. "We do not go to the English doctors. If the bishop hears even a whisper of us seeking worldly medicine for things that belong in God's hands, we will be put in the Red Book. We will be shunned. You must never speak of this again." "But the land, Isaac," I whispered, tears hot in my eyes. "The 5-year mark is only 2 years away. If we do not have a child, your mother and the bishop, they will take this house. They will take my father's land." "We must trust the Lord," Isaac said, but his voice lacked conviction. He walked past me into the dark yard, leaving me alone with the smell of hay and the heavy, silent weight of my own fear. It was during the following winter that the first real crack appeared in my trust. The winter of that year was exceptionally harsh. The creek froze solid, and the wind howled through the gaps in our old window frames. Because the roads were often impassable for the horses, Martha came to stay with us for 3 weeks to help with the winter butchering and quilting. One afternoon, while Martha was at the church sewing circle and Isaac was out checking the timber lot, I went into the small spare bedroom where Martha slept. I was looking for an extra set of wool blankets, but as I pulled open the bottom drawer of the old pine dresser, my hand brushed against something hard beneath the heavy quilts. It was a small, leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age. It had belonged to Martha's late husband, the deacon. I knew I should not look. In our community, privacy was a sacred boundary, and looking through an elder's belongings was a serious transgression. But a strange, cold curiosity gripped me. I opened the ledger to the middle pages, expecting to see records of grain sales or church tithes. Instead, I found a list of names and dates written in the deacon's neat, sloping hand. The names were those of young families in our district over the last 30 years. Next to several of the names, there were small, red crosses. As I scanned the list, my eyes stopped on my own family's name, Miller, 60 Acres Bottomland. Beneath it, written in the same faded ink, were the names of my parents, followed by my own name, Rebecca, and next to my name there was a date, the date of my marriage to Isaac, and a single word written in German, Gemeinschaftsbesitz, community property. But what made my blood run cold was the note written directly below it, dated only 2 months before my wedding. The union is approved by the bishop. The stewardship will return to the trust as ordained. The line ends here. The line ends here. The words repeated in my mind like a bell tolling in the distance. Why would my father-in-law write that my marriage was approved with the expectation that the line would end? Why would they assume, before Isaac and I had even spent our first night under the same roof, that we would never have children? I closed the ledger and pushed it back beneath the quilts, my hands shaking so violently I could barely shut the drawer. I went back to the kitchen and sat by the stove, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I tried to tell myself it was a misunderstanding, that perhaps the deacon had simply been making a note about the legal structure of my father's estate. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it began to grow. The next day, I watched Martha as she prepared my evening tea. Her hands were old and spotted with liver spots, but they were incredibly precise as she measured out the dried gray leaves. I watched her spoon them into the teapot, her face calm and expressionless. "Drink it while it is hot, Rebecca," she said, setting the steaming mug on the table. "It does no good if it sits." For the first time in 2 years, I did not drink the tea. When Martha went to the pantry to fetch some flour, I quickly poured the dark liquid into a potted geranium that sat on the windowsill, leaving just a tiny drop at the bottom of the mug. I did the same thing the next night, and the night after that. Within a week, the geranium's leaves began to yellow and curl, turning black at the edges, before the plant withered completely and died. A cold, sickening dread washed over me. The wild carrot seed and blue cohosh Martha was giving me were not herbal remedies to help me conceive. I knew enough about wild plants to know that in certain quantities, and when prepared in a specific way, those very herbs were used by the old midwives to prevent a woman from holding a child. They were ensuring I remained barren. But why? Why would a mother want her own son's marriage to be childless? Why would a bishop who spoke so passionately about the sanctity of the land want our lineage to end? The answer began to take shape, and it was a ladder of betrayal that went higher than I had ever dared to look. If I remained childless, the 60 acres of prime bottomland, land that my father had kept independent from the church's communal holdings, would automatically revert to the church trust under the 5-year rule. The trust was controlled by Bishop Aaron and Martha's family. They didn't want Isaac to have an heir, because they wanted the land. And Isaac, my quiet, gentle husband, where did he stand in this? Did he know? Was he complicit in the theft of my family's heritage? I began to watch Isaac with a hypervigilance that bordered on madness. I looked for signs of guilt in the way he avoided my eyes, in his long hours in the fields, in the way he never questioned his mother's presence in our home. I felt completely isolated. I could not go to my neighbors. To accuse the deacon's widow and the bishop of poisoning my fertility to steal my land would have been seen as a delusional attack on the church leadership. I would have been shunned immediately. stripped of my home and my reputation before the week was out. Then, in the late spring, Isaac began to take weekly trips to the English town of Millersburg. He claimed he was going to buy specialty harness leather and iron fittings for the spring planting, but he would be gone for the entire day, returning long after the sun had set. One evening, after he had gone to bed, I went out to his buggy. In the small storage box beneath the seat, I found a white paper envelope. Inside was a receipt from a private medical clinic in Millersburg, a clinic that specialized in reproductive health. The receipt was made out to Isaac King. It was dated 3 weeks prior, and there was a handwritten note at the bottom from a doctor. Results of analysis confirm complete viability. No physical or biological impediment detected. Patient is fully fertile. My heart stopped. Isaac had gone to an English doctor. He had broken the strictest rule of our district, risking shunning and eternal damnation in the eyes of our church, to test himself. He wanted to know if he was the reason we had no child, and the results proved he was not. If Isaac was fertile, and if he had gone to the clinic in secret, it meant he did not know about his mother's tea. It meant he was not part of the conspiracy to steal my land. He was as much a victim of their manipulation as I was. He was desperately searching for answers in the English world, because his own mother and his bishop had convinced him that the childless marriage was a judgment from God on his own head. A wave of intense relief and love for my husband washed over me, followed immediately by a fierce, protective anger. Isaac was innocent. The man I had married, the man who had worked himself to the bone on my father's land, was not my betrayer. He was my ally, even if he did not know it yet. I kept my discoveries to myself. I continued to dump Martha's tea into the dead geranium pot, which I had replaced with a fresh plant of the same kind to avoid suspicion. I smiled at Martha when she came to visit, though every bone in my body screamed to throw her out of my kitchen. I waited, and I prayed, and then, in September, the change came. It began with a subtle tenderness in my breasts, a morning tiredness that did not disappear after my first cup of coffee, and a strange, metallic taste in my mouth. I waited until my cycle was 3 weeks late before I dared to believe it. I went to the dry goods store in town, the English store where nobody knew my name, and bought a small plastic testing stick. I hid it in the sleeve of my winter coat, and that night, while Isaac slept, I took the test by the dim light of a single candle. 2 pink lines appeared in the small window. I was pregnant. Against all the odds, against the bitter herbs and the quiet schemes of the elders, a new life had taken root inside me. I sat on the cold floor of the bathroom, tears streaming down my face, holding the small plastic stick against my chest. It felt like a miracle, a direct sign from the heavens that my father's land and my own body were not meant to be sacrificed to the greed of Martha and the bishop. But the joy was short-lived. The realization of what this meant descended on me like a suffocating blanket. In our community, my pregnancy would not be seen as a simple blessing. It would be seen as a direct challenge to the plans that had been set in motion before we were even married. If Martha and the bishop knew I was pregnant, they would know their scheme had failed. They would know I had stopped taking the herbs, and they would look for a way to discredit the child, to discredit me. That brought me to that October morning in the kitchen. The steam rose from the coffee pot on the stove, and the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and frying eggs. Isaac sat at the table, his fork hovering in the air, his face pale and frozen. "Who else knew?" he asked again, his voice cracking slightly, as he finally looked up at me. His gray eyes were wide, not with anger, but with an absolute paralyzing terror. I walked over to the table and sat down opposite him. I did not reach for his hand. I kept my hands folded in my lap, keeping my voice as calm and steady as I could. "Nobody, Isaac," I said. "No one knows but me. And now you." Isaac let out a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders dropping as if a massive physical weight had been placed upon them. He set his fork down on the plate with a small clatter. "Why do you ask me that, Isaac?" I asked quietly, leaning forward. "Why is your first question about who else knows that we are finally going to have a child? Shouldn't we be praising God?" Isaac looked toward the window, his eyes darting to the gravel driveway, as if he expected his mother's carriage to appear at any moment. He rubbed his face with his calloused hands, his chest heaving. You don't understand, Rebecca.